Good evening. I'm James Roth, Acting Director of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum. And on behalf of my colleague, Stephen Rothstein, and all of our Library and Foundation colleagues, I thank you for coming this evening. I would also like to acknowledge the generous support of our underwriters at the Kennedy Library Forums, lead sponsor, Bank of America, the Lowell Institute, and our media sponsors, the Boston Globe, Xfinity, and Wbur. This year marks the centennial of John F. Kennedy's birth on May 29, 1917. As we honor his life and legacy during this centennial year, we frequently revisit the pivotal election of 1960 and the indelible televised debates between then Senator Kennedy and then Vice President Nixon. We look forward to exploring that election as well as so many other facets of President Nixon's career in more detail tonight. I'm delighted to introduce John A. Farrell, author of Richard Nixon, The Life. His previous books include Clarence, Darrow, Attorney for the Damned, which won the Los Angeles Times Book Prize for the Best Biography of 2011, and Tip O'Neill and the Democratic Century. He is a contributing editor to Political Magazine and a contributor to The Atlantic, after a prize-winning career as a newspaperman, most notably at the Denver Post and the Boston Globe, where he worked as White House correspondent and served on the renowned Spotlight team. I should also mention that Mr. Farrell has graciously agreed to sign books following the forum, and copies are available for purchase in our bookstore for those interested. The signing will take place right outside the Smith Hall lobby here. I'm also pleased to introduce our moderator for the evening, Brian McGrory, editor of the Boston Globe. He has also worked as an award-winning Metro columnist and White House correspondent over his 27 years at the Globe. Since he became editor in late 2012, the Globe has won 4 Pulitzer Prizes for breaking news and coverage of the marathon bombings, for feature photography, for commentary, and for editorial writing. Very good. Mr. McGrory has also authored 4 published novels and a book about his family's pet rooster, Buddy, which I really like. Thank you. Jack and Brian, thank you for joining us tonight, and welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who has come out on this beautiful night. Thank you to people who are watching at home. And thanks most of all to Jack for making the trip back to Boston to be here with us. Jack and I were colleagues in the Globe's Washington Bureau for a long time, so it's a real pleasure to be sitting here with you and to discuss this great accomplishment. I will say that various reviewers have described your biography as, and I'll quote, melodious, beautifully written, deeply insightful, expert, superb, highly detailed, a liquid style that slips easily down the gullet. These are the types of compliments that can really put a strain in our relationship here. They're so good, from one writer to another. Congratulations on this extraordinary work. But I have to start out by asking you, how long ago did you begin this?
6 years ago.
So when you first submitted your proposal and signed your book contract 6 years ago, could you ever foresee the circumstances under which this book was published?
No, and it was an editor at Doubleday came up with this idea that the world needed a single-volume Nixon biography. And he came to me and asked if I would like to do it, and it took me about 15 seconds to say yes. But as far as looking far ahead to the idea that Donald Trump would one day be occupying the Oval Office, and that this in turn would make my book such a huge success because I can't get off of radio and television talking about the comparisons between Trump and Nixon. The only thing I'll say about this particular editor is that if he assigns a book on the Spanish flu, go get your inoculations.
You're making everyone all misty-eyed at your success with Donald Trump as president. This is great.
Good for Jack, bad for the country.
So, are they really alike, or are they not?
There's more been a series of circumstances that are very alike. Personally, the two men are alike mostly in that they practice what I call in the book the politics of grievance. Nixon had this amazing ability from his own tortured soul to recognize in his crowds their fears. He used to he told Bill Safire, the columnist for the New York Times, that people don't react to love, they react to fear. That's not what they tell you in Sunday school, Bill, but that's the truth. And I think that Trump's campaign was very much like that as well. And at times, he even adopted some of the Nixonian phrases like law and order, and he even actually talked about speaking out and tapping the great silent majority, which is what Nixon called his relationship with middle America. So in that regard, they were like, there was a certain grandiosity in them. Nixon's tapes at times can sound as raw and egotistical as Trump's tweets. But mostly it's this just amazing set of circumstances. There was a break-in at the Democratic National Committee. There was massive crowds protesting the inauguration in the streets 3 days later. There are allegations of eavesdropping. There was a attorney general let go, and then a U.S. attorney from New York let go, and then finally, last week we had like the trifecta. We had the Saturday Night Massacre redone, and of course, I guess it's just the Daily Double. And then Donald Trump talking about the fact that there could be tapes. And when I heard tapes, I just said, well, this is it. My life is ruined for the next 2 weeks because I'm going to be on radio trying to explain to people that it's not Watergate yet. We don't know that there's even been a crime. The Saturday Night Massacre happened 6 months after Nixon had begun to fire his staff, go on television, do the limited hangout route, for those of you who are old enough to remember the Watergate jargon. And then you had John Dean testifying all summer about the president's involvement in this. You had memos come out that showed that the CIA had been used to rein in the FBI. And finally, you had Alexander Butterfield, Nixon's aide, come and testify and say, yeah, there are tapes. So that by the time Cox came to Nixon with the subpoenas and Nixon was forced to fire him, we all knew what the crime was, what Nixon was being accused of, and what the special prosecutor was after. Whereas this whole thing with Comey, as I wrote as a Globe correspondent on Sunday, could just be crazy Don Trump being Trump. We just don't know. So this Twitter world that we live in, we want to get to the end real fast, but I don't think we're going to get there. I think it's going to take weeks, months, maybe even years.
There are key differences between the two as well, right? I mean, just to prime the pump here, and feel free to...
Because obviously you needed to, given the length of my first answer.
Feel free to disagree here, but Nixon was somebody who was almost consumed by self-doubt. Donald Trump seems to know no self-doubt.
There's a... As you do biography, at least I have, in 3 books, become much more and more fascinated with family upbringing. Nixon had a blowhard, borderline abusive father, and he had a very religious Quaker mother, but she was the cold, reserved type who would retreat into her closet to pray. And as Nixon himself famously said, never once in my life did she tell me that she loved me. So Nixon, in his whole life, was always trying to meet his father's stony approval and get his mother's love. And the fact that he never could really gave him this sort of feeling of doubt, self-doubt that bordered on self-loathing. There are times when you listen to the White House tapes where you want to reach back into time and grab the President of the United States by the lapels and say, stop it. Stop it. Today you did good. Stop it. Give yourself a little bit of credit. You went to China. And yet he comes back from China, and there it is on the White House tapes. He's talking to Henry Kissinger, and he says, Henry, the American people are a bunch of dumb sheep. I went to China, I shook hands with Mao. It meant nothing. You and I know that, but these, stupid voters out there, they think that a couple of pictures make a big difference. And you just feel so, at least I felt, so torn by this poor guy who could never stop whispering in his ear that he wasn't good enough. He was Iago to his own Othello, and constantly demeaning himself and finally bringing himself down that way. Trump, from what we know, had a severe father who favored an older brother, as did Nixon's dad. I don't know a lot about Trump's mom, but I do know that Don was sent away at the age of 12 or 13 to military school, sort of banished from the family. And, it's likely that there is a similarity there between he and Nixon, and that they are, constantly looking to get the love that they wanted in their childhood from the public acclaim of being either a big shot developer or, in both cases, President of the United States.
Mm-hmm. Talk about the relationship, their respective relationships with the news media, what you know of Nixon and what you've seen of Donald Trump from your vantage point.
Trump is an interesting case because I don't really believe that he hates the news media the way that he tries to portray himself in his tweets.
Can I interject
Sure.
there? I know it's your night, but he needs the media. I mean, he has an almost pathological need to be accepted by the news media.
And he manipulated it quite expertly in his rise in New York. He played the tabloid culture there, which, as you know, being a political reporter is like nothing anywhere else in the world. He played it well. He rose, he became known between the New York tabloids and then finally reality television. So the media to him is his métier. Yeah. For Nixon, it was this constant nagging enemy, this constant. He was a very private man, and the press was always poking and prodding to try to find out what made Nixon tick, right? Trump doesn't care if the press pokes and prods. He
loves it.
Loves it.
Yeah.
So the interesting thing is that when they finally came out with their famous phrase, in Nixon's case, the press is the enemy, the press is the enemy. Write that on your blackboard, Henry, 100 times. The press is the enemy. He didn't go on to say the press is the enemy of the people. And that's what Trump did. And that's a step further. That's really demagogic, turning the First Amendment on against the American people, turning their watchdogs as the enemy of the American people. Nixon never went that far. He'd been Eisenhower's vice president, and he had a certain reverence for the office, despite what he did when he became president, that you get a feeling that Trump doesn't have.
You had many, many revelations in the course of this book. Tell us about the bombshell of Nixon's role in the Johnson attempts, Lyndon Johnson's attempts to reach a peace treaty in Vietnam during the 1968 campaign.
Yeah. I mean, I learned many things in journalism at Spotlight. One of them is turn every page. However long you're in there going through the documents, make sure you turn every page, because you never know what's going to be misfiled or what's going to pop up on the next page. And now I knew that one of the things I would have to address in the biography of Richard Nixon is Vietnam, and I knew that there was this story that had gone on for many, many years that Nixon had interfered with Johnson's peace process in 1968. But although the major bones of that story had been in place by other historians, nobody could ever tie the orders, the directives, to Richard Nixon's mouth. And in a famous tape at the Johnson Library, Presidential Library, you can hear Nixon denying it to Lyndon Johnson a week before the election, or you can go online, you can watch him deny it specifically to David Frost in the famous Frost-Nixon interviews. So he always denied it, and nobody has ever been able to pin it on Nixon himself. And there was a release of political papers from the 1968 campaign. I was turning every page, and all of a sudden there was this vein, very rich vein of documents that had been gathered together by Bob Haldeman, who was Nixon's chief of staff, if you remember H.R. Haldeman. And they all were about this episode, and in the midst of those papers was a yellow legal pad with Nixon's orders that he had barked out to Haldeman. This is what I want you to do. And the first one was to get their people working on the South Vietnamese any way we can monkey wrench the peace talks, Johnson's peace initiative. And it happened. LBJ had eavesdropping on the South Vietnamese embassy, and they recorded somebody from the Nixon campaign calling and saying, drag your feet, you'll get a better deal. And so the question is open to history as to whether or not there could have been a peace settlement that fall. It's probably unlikely, given the stubbornness of the North Vietnamese and the South Vietnamese in the years to follow. But for me, as a biographer trying to capture a president's character and what he was willing to do to advance his own career, the idea that you would play with an undetermined number of lives that later turned out to be 20,000 American lives and 2 million Cambodians and Vietnamese lives, the idea that you would risk all that, risk an actual peace shoot that was, stomp on a shoot that was growing to get yourself elected, I thought was reprehensible. And I think it's far worse than anything that Nixon ever did, even in Watergate.
So let's step back a little bit. You have this Doubleday editor who was apparently the only person in America 6 years ago who had this notion that Donald Trump might be president someday and that we might want a Nixon biography to draw comparisons. When you first had the idea of being a Nixon biographer raised to you, what were your vague impressions? But more important, how did your view of Richard Nixon change over time in the years of research to which you devoted?
It changed pretty drastically. I think that unless you do a biography of maybe Hitler, Mussolini, or Stalin, or Lenin, maybe, there's a chance that in looking at the human being and looking at the factors that made the human being who they were, that you're going to develop sympathy. You're going to be empathetic about this person, even this diabolical political villain. And so pretty early in the process, I had changed I had a working title for the book that was Richard Nixon, An American Tragedy. Because I would read through Elliot Richardson's notes or Henry Kissinger's commentary, and they were struck, while they watched it happen, as how this person reminded them of a Shakespearean or a Greek tragic villain with a fatal flaw that was dragging him down, that even this person in the end came to recognize and yet could not stop himself from going down that path. And so over time, Nixon, who for me had been the Nixon of Hunter Thompson, or the Nixon of The Simpsons, or the Nixon of all the movies where the bank robbers pull on a rubber mask before they go in to pull off the heist. It's always a Nixon mask, and that was Tricky Dick to me. And I gradually began to see more of the man. And one of the nicest reviews I got was from NPR, in which they said Farrell humanizes Nixon without excusing him. And that was pretty much my target of what I was trying to do.
And that is incredibly true. There is a humanity to this book, and you show the vulnerability of this guy in a way that I had never thought about before, and I think a lot of people hadn't thought about before.
And the other I fell in love with Pat Nixon. I mean, I'm sorry, at the time when I was 16, she was Plastic Pat. She was so square. She was just like everything that the 60s were not about. And the only squarer person on the planet was probably her husband, or maybe Queen Elizabeth. But as I got to know Pat through her writings, through their love letters to each other, to her diary entries, she has this amazing tart, sardonic sense of humor. There was a moment during Watergate where the House Minority Leader had said something nasty about Pat, and he was due that about Nixon, and he was due that afternoon to be in a photo session with Pat. And so he sidled up to her and he said, "Mrs. Nixon, I want you to know that I was misquoted." And she said, "Yeah, that's what they all say." And then Dick would write her these letters. You'll find them in the book, these amazing letters. I'm sitting at my desk, this lonely barrister, and the rain has stopped and the sun is out and the flowers are here in Whittier, and my thoughts turn to my gypsy princess, my lovely vagabond who, doesn't love me because I'm such a creep, but who I will forever, follow anyway. And Pat, when you could just see Pat sort of exhale, and then she would write back, "Dear Dick, why don't you come over on Wednesday and I'll burn a hamburger for you." And if there's a illustration in the dictionary for long suffering, it should be a picture of Pat Nixon. So.
What was their relationship like, though, as it progressed? Did they have a close relationship through their White House years?
She hated politics. hated what it did to Nixon. It turned Nixon into a very tense, constantly uptight, scheming, the scheming caricature that we see. And she didn't like that happening to her husband. So she hated politics. Every time he ran for a big office, he had to do the work to convince her that she would go along. But finally, she just recognized that this is who he was, and that, as he famously said, I'll be intellectually dead in 2 years and physically dead in 5 years if I don't run again in 1968. And she finally went along with that. She did a great job raising her daughters. She was a great grandmother, and after they both left Washington, she didn't have to stay at San Clemente. She didn't have to, hang out with him. And there was a repair in their relationship in those years in exile, and there was some warmth that grew back into in their love of each other, to the point that it's very difficult to see the pictures or the film of Dick Nixon at Pat Nixon's funeral, because the agony in his face is such that it's hard to view.
I don't know another way to ask this, so I'll just say it. Do you like Richard Nixon?
One of the first things that struck me as I began to do this was how protective the aides who have survived were about him. George Shultz, remember George Shultz? He was Treasury Secretary and then later went on to be Secretary of State for Ronald Reagan. And I had this interview with him where I was trying to get him to say nasty things because he'd had a big run-in with Nixon over Watergate and using the IRS to read political enemies' tax returns. And so I was prodding him, and finally George Shultz said, well, he's like that little girl in the Longfellow poem. And I'm like, little girl in the Longfellow poem, okay, which one is that? And he said, George Shultz, there was a little girl who had a little curl right in the middle of her forehead. And when she was good, she was very, very good. And when she was bad, she was horrid. And that is pretty much how I came to feel about Nixon. I liked him a lot more than I expected to. I can never forgive, personally, I can never forgive him for continuing that war. That war was both morally wrong and a huge strategic mistake. And he continued it for political purposes time and again. And I think history should roast him for that. But I often say when I'm asked about the book that and yet is the phrase that pops up a lot, because and yet Nixon also created the Environmental Protection Agency. He also signed the law that allowed there to be cost of living increases for seniors. He signed the Endangered Species Act, Title IX, did away with the draft, lowered the voting age, and segregated more Southern schools than either John Kennedy or Lyndon Johnson did in the wake of the Brown versus Board of Education announcement. Nixon is the one who actually finally came around to implementing Brown versus Board of Education. So, and yet is a phrase that pops up several times in the book, and it pops up a lot when I talk about him.
So let's get to some of this in just a moment. But when you're writing a biography, do you end up basically living with this guy in your mind for years at a time?
Yeah, I did. I've done 3.
Is that unhealthy?
Yes. Tip O'Neill was a delight, right? I mean, can you imagine living with Tip O'Neill for 5 years? I mean, it was wonderful. And Clarence Darrow, in his own way, was a delight. A slightly pricklier person, probably with more sharper edges than Tip, but a great liberal hero, somebody who I admired all my life. Really was somebody I loved those courtroom dramas, whether it was the Scopes Monkey trial or the Leopold Loeb murder case. I mean, there's a reason why there's movie after movie about Clarence Darrow, starting with Inherit the Wind. So that he was pretty easy to live with. Nixon was harder to live with because it was such grim history, and there was always this tragedy unfolding, and you had to listen to him say incredibly ugly things about Jews and blacks and Irish and Italians and Mexicans and gays on those tapes, and you had to listen to a lot of those tapes, and it was a demoralizing experience. It really treated you to a part of humanity that doesn't make you jump up out of bed in the morning and say, boy, how's Tip going to make me laugh today, right? It was going to be more like, can I keep from throwing up as I listen to the next tape? Yeah.
Let's talk about the race stuff. Very complex topic when it comes to Richard Nixon.
Yeah.
You have the Southern strategy, you have the overt bigotry, but as you said a few minutes ago, you have a lot of accomplishment on that front as well.
There are two places I step out of the narrative. One of them you already talked about, which is the press. I actually devote sort of half a chapter just to talking about how Nixon's relationship with the press developed. And then there's race. And I think that in the 20th century, race is this very important prism by which to judge Americans, especially American leaders. And Nixon started out with that Quaker background as a moderate Republican. Remember when there used to be moderate Republicans? As a moderate Republican, one of many who supported the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act. And in 1957, for the first Civil Rights Act that was passed since Reconstruction, Nixon was on the side of the angels, and JFK and LBJ were dragging their feet because they wanted to keep the Solid South together in the 1960 election. And Martin Luther King at that time wrote to a journalist who asked him about Nixon, and he said two things. He said, first of all, I believe that this man could not have a racist bone in his body, but if he does, if he's that good at lying, then he's the most dangerous man in America. And it wasn't until the 60 campaign, when Nixon got a feeling that he could win down south, that Martin Luther King was arrested at a demonstration in Atlanta, famously taken away in shackles in the middle of the night to a rural prison where his aides and his wife were just convinced he was going to be murdered either on the way or in his cell. And the Kennedy brothers interceded with the Georgia governor and got him out. And Nixon, given the same opportunity, declined to do so. And his campaign's only comment was no comment. And afterwards, Jackie Robinson went to see him. Jackie Robinson was the ball player who integrated Major League Baseball, was a Nixon supporter in 1960. And he went to see him in his hotel room in Chicago. And nobody knows what went on in that room, but Sapphire tells us that when Jackie Robinson came out, he had tears streaming down his face. He was so frustrated. And Martin Luther King at that point said that Nixon had failed this test of moral courage. Well, it was this big dangling plum for the Republicans. And the Republicans had been the party of civil rights since Lincoln. And they couldn't resist the idea that if they added the South to the West and to the Midwest, and a few last bastions in the Northeast, that they could become the majority party again, as they have. And so you had this development of what's called the Southern strategy. The first inclinations came in Eisenhower's campaign. He actually carried Texas and Tennessee and Florida and Virginia. Nixon carries those same outside states, border South states, because he's running against Wallace in 1968. And Wallace is going to take Mississippi. George Wallace, governor of Alabama, racist, was going to take Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and Louisiana. And then finally in 1972, Nixon's great triumphant landslide, the biggest to its time, he finally sweeps the South, and the South begins its final, through Reagan, its final transformation from Democrat to Republican. So at different points along the way, Nixon is confronted with political expediency versus principle, and he chooses political expediency. But once he gets into office, the Supreme Court has said to Johnson, now is saying to Nixon, desegregate, desegregate, desegregate. No more stalling. You have to do it now. And Nixon, does not want the credit. He doesn't want white Southerners to know that he's going to desegregate the schools, but he has to do it. So he calls it very quietly. He calls in George Shultz and Leonard Garment and a few other people, and he says, we got to do it. No violence, and we're not going to take any publicity for it. And so they go down to the southern states, and they put together citizen community groups, half black, half white. They hash it out and hash it out. They get Congress to give them a pot of money of $3 billion, and they finally take him to the White House for the final deal, and they set him in the Roosevelt room across from the Oval Office. And John Mitchell, remember John Mitchell comes in, and John Mitchell says, it's not if anymore, guys, it's when, and it's now. we're going to do this. And then they brought into the Oval Office, and Nixon hated talking to people. He was such an awkward person that one-to-one personal communications was very, very difficult for him. Anything that he could train for, anything that he could rehearse, he was good at. He gave really good speeches and press conferences. But in actual communicating with individuals was hard for him. So bringing these people in, these black and white people from Atlanta or from New Orleans, and convincing them that this was the right thing to do and that this is what the majesty of this office demands that we all do, me the president and you the citizens. It was an amazing deal. And when it was over, by a factor of maybe 10, more black kids were going to white schools down south, and Nixon had a 43 to 40% approval rating among black voters in the South. And yet, he did not, there it is again, and yet, he did not want political approval for this because it would alienate the Southerners. And so he did it all very quietly, never took any credit for it. And as Daniel Patrick Moynihan, the Harvard professor who worked for Nixon, said, it was all done quietly because we didn't want to piss off Strom Thurmond, and we managed to do it.
Without canonizing him, which you certainly didn't, let's get into some of the other and yet stuff that you mentioned earlier. The Clean Air Act, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, affirmative action programs. Let's talk about some of what else you did to be good.
The leaders of the major environmental groups were polled several years back and asked which of the presidents was the greatest for the environment. And Teddy Roosevelt, of course, the great conservationist, creator of the national parks, came in first, and Richard Nixon came in second. And in part, it was Nixon's political expediency, because 8 days after he took the oath of office, America had its greatest environmental catastrophe. The Santa Barbara oil spill fouled the beaches of Southern California, all the way from Santa Barbara down to Catalina. And so that was happening. Rachel Carson had written about Silent Spring, about the use of pesticides, and in 1970, you had the first Earth Day. So there was this movement that was growing that Nixon, as a politician, recognized and wanted to take advantage of. But as with everything that the Democratic Congress of that time gave him, he had the veto. He could have vetoed it. And he had aides who worked with the crafting of the legislation. And much of that legislation had Republican majorities, because those were the days when there was actually bipartisanship. Remember that bipartisanship in Washington? And the two parties cooperated in a lot of this legislation. And Nixon was happy to sign it, in part because he wanted to get on to international affairs, which is what really interested him. It's kind of interesting now that if you go out to the Nixon Library, there's a big placard there about Title IX and the fact that generations of young women have been able to go on scholarships to college and play sports because Nixon signed Title IX. Well, if you look at the paper behind that decision, Nixon's best buddy was Woody Hayes at Ohio State, and you had Father Herzberg from Notre Dame writing him constantly saying, you can't have this, it's going to ruin our football programs. And you have Nixon saying, we can't do this, it's going to ruin their football programs. And yet, in the end, he signed it. And so, did I just say and yet again? I just did it. And so, if you listen to the tapes, you hear Nixon going back and forth, talking to himself about these issues. But in the end, when he had a chance, and he could have vetoed, he signed these things.
Stay on that issue for a moment of bipartisanship. Who did you cover the White House for a good number of years? George H.W. Bush, first term Bill Clinton?
Yeah.
You're familiar...
Both Bushes, and then Clinton in between.
You're familiar with Washington as a bipartisan place. Washington is a place where things actually got done. Is you spent years looking back at the late 60s and early 70s, it was even more pronounced back then. Does that make today seem all the stranger, or looking back, did it seem like a foreign land to you? Not really wording this right. Which is, as you see it now, as you saw it then, as you saw it yourself, which one doesn't fit?
Now is the aberration just because it's so extreme. And I think it's because, and this is really sad, and Nixon actually warns us about this in his goodbye speech the day right before he gets on the helicopter and says goodbye, he has a speech in the East Wing of the White House. And remember, he talks about hate, and those who hate you will fail unless you hate them, and then you destroy yourself. And these are strong cautionary words. This is one place where we should listen to Richard Nixon, because we're at that place. We're divided into tribes, and these are our fellow Americans. This is not an enemy. These are neighbors. These are people who happen to live in a different state. I think Obama's greatest failure was that Obama lit a spark in my life when he talked about no red states, no blue states, there's just the United States. And he offered that moment that we possibly could go back. There are some signs, very tiny signs, that people are getting, that people now recognize the danger. You hear more and more people speaking like I just did, cautioning about this polarization and how damaging it is. But it's really, really bad. And while I was doing the Clarence Darrow book, I worked for a year at a magazine called National Journal. And National Journal is for the wonks. And one of the things it does is every year it examines every member of Congress. And it draws a line down the center. And it's been doing this since the 1960s. And you always had a dozen Republicans to the left of that line. And you always had a dozen Democrats to the right of that line. And for the last 5 or 6, 10 years that the National Journal has been doing it, that number has shrunk and shrunk and shrunk. And now there's nobody on either side of that line. And that's happened now for 2 or 3 Congresses in a row. So this is the extreme that worries me.
And you mentioned in the book Lowell as an example. Somebody, or in the Globe essay, somebody who would have stood up back then, where there's nobody who stands up now in the Republican Party except for John McCain.
Bill Cohen of Maine. You had members on the House Judiciary Committee who voted for impeachment. You had members on the Senate Watergate Committee like Weicker who were effective cross-examiners. You had Howard Baker, the Republican leader of the Senate Watergate Committee, working, not standing in the way of an investigation, even though it's his party, but making sure that the subpoenas are done fairly, but that they actually get to the bottom of things. You don't have that yet in the case of Donald Trump, and I think the big difference between Nixon and Trump is that Nixon had this antagonistic Democratic Congress, and Trump is protected by a Republican Congress. And until you, the voters, begin to register your outrage at the polls or your agreement, the Republicans are not going to change it. They're going to be like this until they get a 2x4 to the head. And it's only going to be delivered on Election Day. I don't think that public opinion polls are going to change things.
Talk about foreign affairs, which it sounds like was Nixon's true passion. Go through his greatest achievements and failures.
Every president wanted an arms deal with the Soviets. Nixon got the first one, Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty. First American president to go to Moscow. I hardly remember him about this at all anymore because his even greater accomplishment was, of course, to go to China. As Mr. Spock says in one of the Star Trek movies, there's an old Vulcan proverb, only Nixon can go to China, which is actually a paraphrasing, that famous is a paraphrasing of something that Chairman Mao told him, which is that men of the right can do what men of the left cannot do. But it's interesting, one more difference between he and Trump. Nixon was a foreign policy scholar and something of a visionary. In 1965, he wrote this article called Asia Beyond Vietnam. This is 1965. And he writes about how all we have to do is buy a little bit more time in Southeast Asia because the next century and the closing years of this century are going to be all about the information age, the dawning information age, where computers and creativity and nimbleness are going to be the values that carry the day, not some totalitarian government's ability to put workers into factories or onto factory farms. And he really looks ahead, and he says the biggest problem about this scenario is China, because China is sitting there, 800 million of the brightest and best people on the planet. He had great regard for the Chinese and their talents and their strengths. And we cannot let them sit there stewing in their own juices. We have to pull them into the family of nations if this trend is going to work. And if it works, he said, we could have 20 years of peace. No world wars for 20 years. That was his goal. And no nuclear war. And in fact, we've now had 50 years since he was in office, and even more if you go all the way back to World War II. In part because an unbelievable accident of history, the Soviet Union and the Chinese get into a fight over a godforsaken stretch of Siberia that nobody in their right mind would ever want, but became a matter of pride to them. The Soviets took all their tank divisions that were facing West Germany and moved them to this river in Siberia. They got in touch with the American government and asked if we would join them on a bombing strike on the Chinese nuclear facilities before they could develop a nuclear arsenal. That's how against each other they were. And so Nixon and Kissinger Nixon in particular saw that there was a chance to drive a wedge between the two great communist giants. And he did so very effectively. And he brought China into the family of nations where it has developed this huge middle class. So instead of 800 million irate red guards with a nuclear arsenal ready to wreak havoc on Asia, there now are financiers, there are trading partners, and this balance that he and Kissinger had in mind of Nixon used to hold up his hand and close it into a fist, and he would say, the United States, Japan, Western Europe, Soviet Union, and China. 5 different power bases instead of one superpower. Balancing each other off will bring us stability and a world of peace. And with the exception of the Islamic Revolution, it has been a time of peace for a long time.
I am still shocked that you have the audacity to suggest that Donald Trump is not a foreign policy scholar, but we'll continue on nonetheless. Before there was Romney Care, before there was Obamacare, there wasn't called this, but there was Nixon Care. I mean, he in many ways was the pioneer of making sure that people got the health care coverage, which he felt was not necessarily a right, but part of being a person in the United States.
Yeah, he had seen it in his own family. His family had been torn apart by the death of his older brother, Harold, who was the brightest and the best. Took a long time to die, 6 years of tuberculosis, and wasted the family's finances. It's the cause of some of Nixon's resentments because he couldn't go to the Ivy League where he had been accepted because the family's finances had been ruined by Harold's death. It also separated Nixon from his mother because she went with Harold to Arizona where the air was better and left the household. And then his younger brother, who was like the baby of the family with golden curls, Arthur. And Arthur died of meningitis in a week. Shocking in its own way, as much as as Harold's lingering death. And if parenthetically, Hannah Nixon named all her sons after English kings, so that's why you have Richard, Arthur, and Harold. So Nixon had this personal feeling, and in 1946, Harry Truman comes out with a proposal for national health insurance, and Nixon's advisors write him this amazing memo which says Republican Party cannot be the party of no, and goes through this whole rationale of how Americans like their health care system, they like their family doctor, but they don't want to be exposed to the idea of if tragedy strikes that we're going to lose our home and all our finances are going to be wiped out. So we need to have a matching proposal. This is 1946. Nixon comes up with something that later emerges when he's president as Nixon Care, later emerges here in Massachusetts as Romney Care, which is the idea that you, instead of going to a government single-payer system, you keep the current private insurance system, but you subsidize it so everybody is covered. Very simple as far as Nixon was concerned. The only big difference between the two plans is that Nixon had a mandate on the employers, but not a mandate on individuals. But in those days, so many more Americans worked at one company for all their lives, and they were big companies and had health care plans. I wouldn't be surprised at all if he had not adopted the individual mandate over time. And Ted Kennedy, in interviews with me and many others, said that his biggest legislative blunder during all his years in the Senate was not accepting Nixon's offer for Nixon Care, because Kennedy saw it as a step in the, looking back, he saw it as a step in the right direction that could eventually have brought us to single payer. But still, it was, looking back, he realized that this was a good deal and he should have taken it instead of hanging tough at the time.
Give us everything we need to know about Watergate in 3 minutes or less.
Don't believe the conspiracy theorists. It happened. Nixon was guilty of the cover-up. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Very guilty, as the tapes show over and over again.
But when you say guilty, what was he guilty of?
Well, let's go back to what caused it, first of all. Haldeman said famously, Nixon didn't order Watergate, didn't order that particular break-in, but he caused Watergate. He created this atmosphere in the White House where he was constantly demanding political intelligence. He was constantly telling Haldeman that the little boys on the campaign don't know how the big boys play it. We need more bugging. We need to tail Ted Kennedy. We need to infiltrate the Democratic campaigns.
He was paranoid. He was scared to death he was going to lose in 1972, correct?
And all this stuff happened. There wasn't, on the top aides in the domestic side of the White House, there were very few who were not running an agent somewhere. They had plans to break in and bug Edmund Muskie's presidential campaign. They tried repeatedly to break in and bug the McGovern headquarters, and they were caught trying to bug the Democratic National headquarters. So this was indeed a wide-based effort, a campaign that is astonishing as I added it all up. 48 individuals or corporations pled guilty, and 40, I think, individuals went to jail from Watergate. And when the burglars were caught, Nixon had, well, maybe 48 hours where he could have called in the Attorney General and said, do your investigation, we're not covering this up, follow it wherever it goes. And he would have lost most of his top aides, including his campaign chairman, John Mitchell, and Haldeman and Ehrlichman, because they all were involved in Watergate or in the break-in in the psychiatrist office of Daniel Ellsberg. Remember him? The whistleblower who leaked the Pentagon Papers? That was another one of their dirty tricks. But Nixon just jumped in. He couldn't stand not being part of it, and he was constantly asking Haldeman and Ehrlichman, what's going on? And in that first week, you have what was called the smoking gun tape, which is a tape in which Nixon orders Haldeman to get the CIA to intercede with the FBI, block the investigation on the grounds that there was a national security issue that needed to be protected. So that is what Nixon was guilty of, obstructing of justice in the cover-up, and that's why he was impeached. And as he later said, I impeached myself when he resigned. So there's some Nixon loyalists who are still trying to fight and tell you it didn't happen, but it happened.
Talk for a moment about his relationship with the Kennedys. Obviously, there's that small matter of the 1960 presidential campaign. But it goes beyond that to relationship with Bobby and then Ted when he was in the Senate and Richard Nixon was president.
Another something I discovered about Nixon doing this book, in 1946 he wins election to the House of Representatives, and he's chosen on a committee to go over to Europe to see the effects of World War II and whether or not the House should pass something called the Marshall Plan. In his district in Southern California, they hate the Marshall Plan. They think these are lazy socialists, and why should we be giving our money to pour it down that rat hole in Europe? Nixon goes over, and of course he sees the devastated cities and the starvation and the hunger. He visits tuberculosis hospitals, comes back convinced that the Marshall Plan absolutely has to pass. We have to be internationalists. We cannot be isolationists. And he goes back to his district and campaigns to change public opinion in his district. Remember the old Edmund Burke about whether you owe your constituents your allegiance or your reason? Well, he decides that he owes them his judgment and his reason. And he goes back there and he turns his district around to such an extent that in California had a screwy political system in those days. He wins both the Republican and the Democratic nomination for Congress in 1948 from that district. Gambles his entire career, those first 24 months in office, and wins. And John Kennedy tells a friend, Richard Nixon is the kind of man we need to have in Washington. And they become fast friends. When Nixon runs for the Senate in 1950, John Kennedy shows up in Nixon's office with a check for the Republican campaign. You know, got to be on the quiet. This is Dad Joe's money. But here's $1,000 for your campaign, Dick. And Dick holds the check and says, you know, he just marvels at it. Jackie and Jack invite Pat and Dick to their wedding. And throughout the, as you can hear in the Kennedy tapes, throughout the Eisenhower years, Jack Kennedy is on the phone to Dick Nixon. They love to talk about foreign affairs. And when Jack Kennedy has one of his health crises and he's being operated on in Walter Reed and it's thought that he's going to die, Richard Nixon is seen clutching the wall in the corridors at Walter Reed, weeping and saying, poor brave Jack is going to die, poor brave Jack is going to die. And that's how close that relationship was. And so when, on election night 1960, Nixon not just loses to JFK, but believes that Kennedy stole the election from him in Texas and Illinois, he feels personally betrayed. And I did not get a lot of cooperation from the Nixon family, but this is one thing that Julie confirmed for me, was that if you really want to trace Watergate back, there are several steps along the way. But if you go back to election night 1960, that was a starting point for Watergate. All that followed with Nixon's insistence that he was never going to be, and this is his words, he was never going to be out-cheated again. And there's an amazing story that's not in the book of a Secret Service agent walking down the aisle of a campaign airplane in '68. And Richard Nixon thinks he's alone, and he's sitting there in his seat, and he's doing this. He's saying, "Got to be tougher. Got to be tougher. Got to be tougher." And this is one of the most aggressive, toughest political campaigners ever. But that's the way the Kennedys got under his skin. And yet, there's this amazing exchanges of letter between Dick Nixon and Jackie Kennedy. The first one is after JFK is assassinated, and Nixon writes this very nice letter to Jackie talking about, remember the days when we all were young at heart. And then Jackie writes back and says, I know, and I'm paraphrasing here, I'm never going to get her eloquence, but she says, I know what's going to happen. You've chased this prize for so long, and now that Jack is dead, you're going to be drawn inexorably back. And I just want to tell you, if you don't get it, if for some reason this doesn't happen, please value your family and the time that you have together. Beautiful, beautiful letter. And then Nixon gets elected president, and Jackie and Jack's paintings are finished, the official portraits at the White House. And she doesn't want to come. This is when she's living in seclusion with John and Caroline. And Nixon invites them back to the White House in secret, never tells the press. They're put on a White House plane, LaGuardia, flown down. They come in, they're given dinner at the White House. The daughters play with Caroline and John. And again, the exchange of letters is amazing. Jackie writing to thank him, talking about how the things they had discussed over dinner, like the fact that, and you never think about this, but it's true, the fact that they never could stand campaigning because every hotel room smelled like fresh paint. Because every hotel manager wanted to impress the presidential candidate by having a freshly painted room. And they would share these little things that only they knew with each other. And John was having a bad time in school that semester. And I don't know if Nixon was there or he learned about it afterwards, but John sat on the Lincoln bed in the Lincoln bedroom and thought that this would be a lucky place to make a wish that he'd do better in school. Caroline complained to Nixon at one point that she didn't like history class. And so Nixon sits down at his desk and he writes these, in longhand, he writes these two amazing letters. One to John saying, well, I heard that you're doing better in school and I'm really glad that your wish came true. And if you ever need to come back and sit on the bed again and make the wish, just let your mom know. And then he writes to Caroline this letter and he talks about how, I didn't like history once when I was your age too, but it's probably just the teacher, and you really need to stick with it because biography and history shows the truths of great men, and it's one more and yet as you read the book, where just as you really want to get into a really righteous sense of hating Nixon, you come across a moment like this where he shows some humanity, even with these people who he later identified as his greatest political enemies.
What about Ted Kennedy? Anything worth noting about that relationship?
He feared Ted Kennedy because Ted Kennedy was the successor, and he had his aides infiltrate Kennedy's Secret Service detail. Even though he wasn't a president or a candidate, Ted Kennedy had Secret Service protection for a time, and Nixon made sure that somebody was on that detail that was reporting back to the White House about who Teddy was seeing and what he was doing. One of the first things, again, this is within the first 100 days. Remember the first 100 days we just finished with Trump? Well, the first 100 days of the Nixon administration, they go out and they hire their first private detective to start doing the dirty tricks and the infiltration and the surveillance. And the first target is to tail Ted Kennedy. And when Chappaquiddick happens, this guy poses as a reporter and goes to Chappaquiddick and hangs out with the press, trying to pick up all the dirt that he can to nail Kennedy. So he was fascinated by Kennedy, and he was determined that he was never going to lose to another Kennedy. And yet, when Ted Kennedy Jr. had his leg amputated, it was Richard Nixon who called the hospital and really moved Ted Kennedy Sr. by the way that he talked to young Ted. Not a big deal, probably a thing that most presidents would do, but the fact that Nixon did it and did it well, I think, is important. And after Chappaquiddick, although it's never come out what the two of them said, the first time Kennedy came to the White House, Nixon pulled him aside for a conversation for a half an hour or 45 minutes in which he reportedly gave him some of the secrets of resilience that had kept Nixon always bouncing back, and sort of fatherly advice to this young senator, don't worry, it's not all over. So complexity there. I mean, the short answer is 80% of the time he probably hated the Kennedys, wanted to do anything possibly that he could to foil them, but he still had that one little spark of humanity in him and could relate to them.
We are going to get to audience questions in just a moment. I just have a couple of quick ones for you. So where does Nixon fit in history in terms of, and it's a bit shtick to do it, but in terms of rankings of presidents?
History does not have to be dreary, Brian. We can have fun with lists. We can do listicles of the presidents. I always get upset when George Washington is not number one and Abraham Lincoln is. Eternal debates. Nixon ranks surprisingly high. He ranks in like 28 or 29, which you think about it, is the only president to resign and to have bungled Vietnam as he did, and to have Watergate as a legacy. Many of the things that we've talked about tonight have struck a chord with historians, and they recognize that he doesn't belong down at the bottom with Andrew Johnson and James Buchanan. I think that one thing that historians do when we rank presidents is we view them through the prism of our days. And so one of the leading issues in our day, still haven't fixed it, is race. And so you see Andrew Jackson, who in the 1930s soared all the way up to number 5 or number 6 because pluralism and populism and the economy were such important issues right before the coming of the New Deal. You see him now slipping and sliding because of what he did to the Indians and because he was a slave owner. You see the Virginians basically, their perch, which seemed concrete forever, Jefferson and the others, seems to be shaking a little bit because of slavery. So I think that Nixon will stay where he is. JFK and LBJ surprised me. They're both in the top 10 still. I would not be surprised to see them slip out of the top 10 because of Vietnam. Obama debuted at number 12, which seemed pretty high, but not totally unfair to me. The ones that you remember went because they were presidents while you lived always do better in the polls. So Reagan's up there, JFK is up there, and LBJ is up there. And who knows, that could be a reason why Nixon still is hanging in the 20s instead of down in the 40s.
If anybody has any questions, feel free to step right up to the microphones in either aisle, and we'll call on you in just a moment. Nixon in retirement, did you ever get invited? He was in New Jersey for a while, at his estate, and he would invite groups of reporters to have lunch with him. Ever?
No. The only time I saw Nixon was in 1969 when he took the oath of office. He went down Pennsylvania Avenue in an open-top car, waving to the crowds with Pat. And then at one juncture outside of the Department of Labor building, I think it was, there was a crowd of Vietnam protesters who started throwing beer cans and stones. And so he retreated into the car. And I was there, not as one of the protesters, but just as a spectator. And so the only thing I saw him was him peering out the window at the radicals who were protesting the war. I would have liked to have gone to. It would have been very valuable. I've talked to several of the reporters who went, and to some of Nixon's aides, including Roger Stone, the infamous Roger Stone. And again, Nixon was just horrible at one-to-one interpersonal communications. So he would rehearse for 2 days before these reporters arrived. He would memorize each one of them. He would memorize what he was going to say when he sat down at dinner, and he had this whole script in his head. And he was quite an actor. He was a very disciplined actor in community theater. It's where he met Pat. And so he could do that. He could apply himself and act as the charming host. But then when it was over, they said that he would just collapse in sweat from the tension of having to be on for that entire 2 or 3 hours.
Yes, first question.
I wondered if you could talk a little about Nixon's smear campaign against Helen Douglas and calling her a communist, which had a devastating effect on her, and also his relationship with Senator Joe McCarthy and the whole anti-communist witch hunts.
Well, when Nixon came to Washington, he was on the House Un-American Activities Committee, and he participated in the investigation that brought down Alger Hiss, identified this New Deal official, former New Deal official, as a communist agent. So he had this immediate payoff. It's one reason why he went from literally a political nobody to vice president in 6 years. This was in 1946. And he made this speech in the House of Representatives where he talked about the threat of internal communism. And Joe McCarthy was there, and Joe McCarthy had to go to West Virginia in 2 weeks to talk on Lincoln Day festivities. And he cribbed whole parts of Nixon's speech and read it to the people of West Virginia. And that was the famous speech where he reached into his pocket and he said, "I have here in my pocket a list of 200 communists who are still in the State Department." And so McCarthyism began. And in 1950, Nixon ran for the Senate in California. There was an internal battle on the Democratic side. Helen Douglas, an actress, a beautiful woman, and also the wife of Melvin Douglas, Hollywood leftist, ran. And Nixon's campaign was awful. It was some of the toughest stuff that I've ever seen in all my years of political campaign reporting. especially when in the middle of that campaign, the Korean War breaks out, and for the first time you actually have communists killing American boys in Korea. And by the end of the campaign, the Nixon press releases sound like something out of 1984, calling on Helen Douglas, the Pink Lady, to recognize the positive aspects of recantation, and doesn't she know that the Red Chinese that she supports are killing Americans across the Pacific. It was really brutal, awful stuff. And Nixon's #1 issue in his early career, one reason why the left Democrats never forgave him, was this virulent anti-communism. And he was caught in the first couple of years of the Eisenhower administration as vice president. He was the guy that I kept sending to McCarthy saying, tone it down, keep it down. And then Nixon would go back and he would say to the White House aides, we cannot lose anti-communism as an issue. It's too important. We have mid-year elections. And finally, Ike turned against McCarthy when McCarthy came out against, started investigating the U.S. Army. And Nixon was left adrift without his #1 issue.
Sir.
Monday morning after Watergate, I called my old secretary, Patty O'Brien, who had gone to work for my good friend Chuck Colson. And I said, Patty, this thing stinks. And she said, you wouldn't believe it. But 6 months ago, Attorney General Mitchell went to Colson, Haldeman, and Ehrlichman and said, I've got this great idea for Watergate. And they said, not on your life. She said, the 4 of them have just gone across the hall into Nixon's office because they've decided they're going to hang Mitchell. I called Patty at noon. She said, you won't believe it. She said, Nixon decided not to hang him, but instead to cover up for him. So I called my old colleagues on Senator Ed Brooks' staff, and I said, what's happening? And 18 months later, you had the resignation. I wonder if today's speech by Senator Bob Corker, Republican of Tennessee, saying enough is enough and something has to be done about Trump, is going to be the beginning of the week after Watergate for Nixon.
It's a good question.
Yeah.
You got an answer?
I think it's going to. Well, first of all, we have to remember that Watergate took a long time to play out. I mean, the burglars were arrested in 1972, and it wasn't until 1974 that Nixon finally resigned. Who knows what's going to play out? But I really don't believe that the Republicans are going to crack until they suffer reverses at the polls, maybe as close as this fall, and if not, then in the mid-year elections in 2018. But I would strongly urge you, sir, to write your thoughts down and send them to the Kennedy Library or send them to the Nixon Library, where they can be put on file, because that's a fascinating story that in all my research I didn't come across it, and I wish I'd interviewed you for the book.
That is an incredibly artful dodge of a good question. There is a difference, though, between Watergate and what we're seeing now. No, I mean, nobody ever questioned Richard Nixon's competence as a leader, did they? I mean, they questioned his motivation, but not his competence. Right. That's what's happening now.
Yeah, in fact, in the '68 campaign, you find that people like Hunter Thompson and Norman Mailer, Bob Woodward, young Navy lieutenant, votes for Richard Nixon, because they see Nixon, Walter Lippmann, they all see Nixon as the competent moderate who can help us out of the fix of these horrible events in 1968. So quite different from this sort of visceral, knee-jerk expression of populism that we get with Trump.
Sir.
Is that less artful?
It's, no, it's very artful. It's more direct, too. So.
Yeah. First off, I love the idea that you did a book on Clarence Darrow. I will pick that up. He's one of my heroes. Yeah. You know, by far. You know, and he didn't win any cases, but you know, he brought these things forward so we could advance them. Nixon is not one of my favorite people. In 1971, I was in Laos, and I had a little Panasonic radio, transistor ones like we used to have, pull out the antenna. And I picked him up on VOA. And here he is telling the American people that we are not in Cambodia or Laos. I'm 15 miles into Laos, and a buddy of mine is 23 miles into Cambodia. And we're burning everything we see. One of the great nightmares that I see in Nixon is I think he believed his own garbage. I mean, he really did. I've heard stories of him walking up and down the hall, talking to the pictures of former presidents, which Silent Cal must have been really a lot of fun, Best he would have said was, shut up, But the point is if you believe your own garbage, and we're in that situation right now, then we can wind up as a nation that is just falling apart. And I think we have a lot to learn from the Nixon presidency and what's happening now. And I think we better learn really, really fast, because I really love this country. And I don't like the idea of it being torn apart by a clown. Thank you.
I didn't hear a question in there, but it was one hell of a statement, and I appreciate it. Sir.
What previous writers on Nixon, if any, did you find helpful in their insights? I'm thinking of two, Gary Wills in Nixon Agonistes and Roger Morris, who wrote a very psychologically inward and dramatic biography that only went up to 1952, and I don't think he ever got it together to write another volume.
Yeah. Good question. Throw Evan Thomas in there, too.
Sure. For all his complaining, Nixon has been blessed with really good biographers. I mean, Stephen Ambrose did a fine job in the 1990s. Morris did a great job on the early years. Gary Wills, certainly with his book on the 68 campaign. You had Norman Mailer writing about the 68 campaign, as I said, and Hunter Thompson. I mean, there's no shortage of great American letters writing about Nixon. There just hasn't been in this century, and there hasn't been written for the millennials. And one of the things that I had to keep in mind when I wrote this book is that the largest generation of Americans is the millennial generation, and that 2/3 of Americans were not alive or living in this country when Richard Nixon resigned the office. So their knowledge of this guy is as a caricature, and there haven't been great books in the 21st century about Nixon, while at the same time there's been this flood of new work of new information that we who work on Nixon can tap. Evan Thomas and Tim Weiner both wrote books that came out 2 years ago, and I believe they started after I started, and then we held mine for a year or 18 months to give some space between them. But I think that shows that Rick Perlstein's another one who's written recently. He wrote this very nice book called Nixonland. So there's plenty of, he's almost an endless font of inspiration for people. But Tom Wicker wrote a book. Remember Tom Wicker, the New York Times correspondent, wrote a book called One of Us back in the, and the books on Watergate are fantastic. But the best, I got to say, the two best, we're really blessed, is that Bob Haldeman kept a diary every night. And the Haldeman diaries are invaluable as a glimpse of the real Nixon. And Henry Kissinger is a great writer. He's a self-made man who worships his creator. But that 3-volume set deserves the Pulitzer Prize that it won. It's remarkable stuff.
So does that make it easier or harder when you've had so many biographers come before you?
Well, my next biography is going to be Edward Kennedy. And that's a tough one because probably if I took a poll tonight, you'd say, what's there still to be said about the Kennedys? But one thing that we count on is that old men and women die and they leave their letters to archives. Tapes pop up that nobody ever expected that they would hear. Grand jury testimony is released. The constant, sort of drip of history happens. And Ted Kennedy left a collection of 300 oral histories at the University of Virginia, and he left his papers here at the JFK Library, and there will be a time of renewed scholarship even for Ted. So, does that answer your question? I think,
yeah. Sir.
So I just wanted to say I recently received my master's degree, and I am a budding Nixon historian, and my hope is to create books that reach the next generation and the character. But I've loved all of your and then moments, but I kind of want to have you talk about the strangest, if not the strangest ever in history, and then moments, which is Nixon's May 9th visit to the Lincoln Memorial. I was wondering, without going into it, you might be able to explain it a lot more better than I could. Is that the closest that we get to the true Nixon, the ripped apart emotionally Nixon who doesn't know what to do, who makes 15,000 phone calls and then decides to make this big leap that we've not seen since? So I was wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit about that and wonder if that's a really important part of the Nixon mystique. Thank you.
Sure. There are always moments in Nixon's life where it didn't take him much to have too much to drink, but when he has too much to drink and the inner mournful Nixon comes out in moments of crisis, moments of anger. In this case, this is 1970. We've just had the invasion of Cambodia. The campuses have erupted. We've had the deaths at Kent State. And Nixon decides in the middle of the night that he's going to go to the Lincoln Memorial and he's going to reach out and communicate with these students who are, nobody's more stunned than these kids who have driven all night to protest, and there's all of a sudden the President of the United States walking up the steps and talking to him. And he does, in his own clumsy way, try to reach out and talk to them. And he talks about the environment, and for some reason that gets him into the beaches of California and surfing. And he talks about foreign affairs, and he talks about when he was a young man, what trips he would take and how that opened his eyes to the world, and that you need to experience the world. And that moment was amazing. We don't have a tape of it. We have recollections of it. But the only other moment I think that matches that in the Nixon presidency is those remarks right before he gets on the helicopter in the East Room, where he talks about hatred. He talks about his mother. Nobody's going to write a book about my mother. And my father was a common man. And all the strains of Nixon come out. And that last line about if you hate, then you destroy yourself, very, very hard-won knowledge that he didn't get until the end. It's not something that I pass on to you just as a Nixon slogan like on a fortune cookie. This was, as he was going out the door, torn and bleeding, he passed on had this moment of insight and passed it on.
Ma'am.
I have a question about the Nixon daughters. I know you said you didn't have much access to the family, but I'm curious if you learned anything about where the daughters are now in their thinking about their father, and particularly their father in Watergate.
Not having talked to them about that, I'm going to have to take a leap. But I know that they and the remaining aides who are part of the private Nixon Foundation have been for 20 years very, very protective of Nixon, very suspicious of scholars. And I think the reason that they didn't cooperate with me is that it's painful, but also that they believe just that anybody from the liberal media intellectual establishment is never going to give them a break. Yeah.
How does that work? Do you send them letters? Do you pay a visit to them?
No, I approach them both personally and introduced myself and said what I was doing.
Like face-to-face?
At an event, yeah. And the event is obviously not the time to whip out a tape recorder and say, what about Watergate?
Why not? Sorry.
And then follow up with a letter that in some cases was answered, other cases was not. Julie told me right from the start, no interviews. And one of the saddest part is that there's a great oral history program at the Nixon Library, and everybody from John Dean to Bob Woodward to one of the guys who was on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial have contributed to it. But as far as I know, Julie and Tricia have not. I did speak to his brother. His younger brother, Ed, is still alive. And Edward, King Edward. And he lives outside Seattle, and he's a former pilot. And I went and interviewed him all morning, and I said, this has been fascinating and so helpful. Can I buy you lunch? And he said, no, let's have lunch. He said, but let me buy you. I got a coupon for the Burger King. So we go out to the driveway, and I walk over to my car, and he says, no, I'll drive. And we get in his car, and here's 86-year-old Ed Nixon, former helicopter pilot for the Navy, driving up the highway so we can get to the next interchange where he has a coupon for the Burger King. So.
Sir.
I was reading John Lewis's second volume of The March, the graphic representation of his history, and there's a scene in there which really moved me where he talks about Bobby Kennedy coming up to him at a meeting in the White House before the Great March and saying, "You changed my mind, you've changed me." Could you talk, because I didn't hear you talk, about the relationship between Bobby Kennedy and Richard Nixon, given their history with McCarthy together, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah. Nixon's famous comment about Bobby Kennedy was, how come he gets to be a son of a bitch and I don't? The real turmoil was, I think, the relationship between Jack and Dick. And Bobby was sort of the operative. And I don't think that Nixon's tumultuous feelings about the Kennedys extended so much to Bobby. Bobby was just, and then when Robert Kennedy ran in '68, Nixon did not have a great opinion of his campaign, did not think he was going to beat Humphrey. But there is a moment in the book where, remember, there was a time period after Robert Kennedy was shot, and when he died, like 48 hours maybe, or 3 days. And so the Nixons were watching the television like everybody else. And there is a scene there where Pat Nixon in particular was torn up and said that poor young boy has died. And so not quite the big psychic fascination as with JFK, but part of the Kennedys.
Let's take one more question from the audience. Sir.
Thank you very much. In the National Portrait Gallery, there's an exhibit called the Gallery of Presidents. And there, in the midst of all this greatness, I came across this wonderful, wonderful portrait of Nixon by Norman Rockwell. Now, I hated Nixon. Long after the time when I got over my hatred of LBJ, I still hated Nixon. But there, in this portrait, I saw a human being. Am I going to find in your book, in ink, something that will explain to me what I found in Norman Rockwell's oil painting?
Well, that's no small challenge. I was very proud of those words, as I said, humanizing without excusing. It's interesting that Norman Rockwell painting, which is very evocative, is now been blown up to the size of maybe half of that wall. And it's the first thing you see when you walk into the Nixon Library, is this huge portrayal by Norman Rockwell. And who better suited to portray the architect of the silent majority than Norman Rockwell? Yeah.
I mean, you can't say it, but I can. You present this man in all his fullness. You really do critics agree, you present a very complex human being who did a lot of good and had a lot of faults. Yeah. And that was the kind of magnificence of this book.
And looks better every day.
So with that in mind, let's conclude. You uniquely, having lived this man for the last 6 years, and having seen, through scholarship, the only president who is left in resignation, what's your prediction? How does the Donald Trump presidency end? Not to put you on the spot.
Somebody said badly, and that's the one-word answer. I think he's going to make it through 4 years. Could be proven wrong as close as tomorrow. But I know they're hiding something. They're acting just like Nixon's men did. They're not telling the truth. They are stonewalling. They put the second most disparaged press secretary in the history of the United States out there. The only one who was worse was Ron Ziegler, who was Richard Nixon's press secretary. So they're acting just like all the president's men did, and yet there is still a possibility that, especially with both houses in Republican hands, that there won't be an impeachment, there won't be a removal for the 25th Amendment for physical reasons. I personally don't think he's going to serve a second term because he'll either be so sick of it and older and not want to do it. I think there are signs that he's not showing his age well. And so the second process, but I think that impeachment, I don't see impeachment in the cards.
It's a good ending on an enormously speculative note. I want to thank Jack for coming up and being here tonight. I want to thank the audience for being terrific, and the Kennedy Library for hosting us. Thank you.